All
All
right,
right.
everyone. Thanks for joining us here. We've got Damon, who's going to be talking about the practice of design spikes and how he has used them um, in his teams as a design leader at multiple enterprises. I'm also going to drop in here before he gets started. He wrote a really detailed and well-crafted article on Smashing Magazine about the practice, which I will drop right in here in the chat box. And with that being said, I think we are ready to go.
All right, thanks very much, Jerry. So guys, welcome, first of all. I'm really pleased that there's so many folks who are interested in pushing UX forward in Agile. Before we start, I wanted to just say that the Agile problem has not been solved for UX, and what you're going to hear today is just one methodology I think is a solution to some of the problems that we as product designers have. I do not think it is the only solution, and I do not think that it is a one-size-fits-all. So that being said, why don't we jump on in? So this is where I say the impressive things about my background. I personally don't like talking about the things I've done in my past per se, because I kind of think that the information I'm going to give you either stands on its own or it doesn't. But that being said, I am Damon Dimmick. I am the Senior Director of UX at Endurance International Group, which is the biggest brand that you've never heard of. It is a huge company that spans multiple continents and has many thousands of employees and owns some of these brands: Bluehost, HostGator, iPage, SiteBuilder, BigRock, Domain.com, ByDomains, Constant Contact, Single Platform, and literally dozens more. I was originally part of the Constant Contact team several years ago when Constant Contact was acquired, and a lot of the members of that team moved up into the corporate ladder from there. So that's a way of saying, I guess, by longhand, that I've got a lot of experience in a lot of different platforms with a lot of different apps, and I think that this model kind of works for most cases, although certainly not all. My team size is around 40 folks. That is comprised of product designers, specialized UX developers, researchers, and innovation catalysts. It's worth noting that our cadence and our philosophy is to hire UX generalists who might have a specialty, but we don't have dedicated specialists. So on my team, you will find maybe a handful of extremely dedicated, say, visual designers, but in general, we're looking for people who have T-shaped skills and who can deliver not just the original inquiry portion, but also the actual granular designs that would happen in the sprints themselves. I'm also a certified Scrum Master, and I've been doing that off and on for about 5 years now. I have the great privilege of working with one of the original founders of Scrum who taught me the ropes. And I would like to say, just for anyone who's had issues with Agile, I also joined the Agile movement as a skeptic and did not at all like it. They had to drag me kicking and screaming into Agile. But after about a year or so, I think I kind of got on board, and now I've fully adopted it. So let's begin where everything should begin. Who is the presentation for? So a couple of assumptions here. I'm assuming that everyone on this call, or most of the folks on this call, knows something about Agile. They're at least trying to use it, and they have something like a Scrum team working in sprints from a backlog. Now, the reason I mention this right off the bat is, although many of us might say, well, of course, that's what Agile, or at least Scrum is, it is actually not the case that all teams do that. And as I've worked through different brands, I've found that sometimes when folks talk about backlogs, they're not talking about anything formalized or prioritized. Sometimes when folks talk about sprints, if they're working in Scrum versus in Kanban, that's sprints that have different lengths and they're kind of cobbled together. But for this discussion, I'm assuming that everyone here kind of has some kind of basic sprint cadence, 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks, has a backlog that is at least being groomed by a product owner, maybe themselves as well, and is generally familiar with how Scrum is supposed to be run, even if you're not running it correctly, and that's fine too. Long way of saying that you should be on board with the Agile Manifesto, and if you're not familiar with it, it's certainly worth revisiting because I think it has a lot to do with how we as designers and as product designers have to interact with the Scrum/Kanban ecosystem. First place I really want to start, and I'm not going to go into a deeper view of Agile here, is with the top listed item on the Agile Manifesto, which is that our highest priority is to satisfy customers through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. These are the magic words that made lean design possible, that made lean UX possible, that really made Agile something exciting. As some of you might remember, back in the waterfall days, there'd be continuous discovery that would go on forever and ever, some kind of a hot handoff, and if you were very, very lucky, the thing that would be delivered in the end looked a little bit like what you designed. Scrum came onto the scene and kind of said, why don't we do things incrementally, try to get stuff out the door as quickly as possible and learn from reality as opposed to kind of sitting in our ivory towers and figuring out what we think people want and then waiting a long time to see that either fail or never complete. It's a pretty great change in the software world, but now we're 15 years into the Agile world. I think it's around 15, yeah. And most companies that are making software at scale are using something like Scrum, and many companies that are startups are using something at least a derivative of Scrum. What does this mean for us? For designers, the challenge of Scrum is that it moves very, very quickly and in small increments. So through speed and iteration, we can take on big issues. At least that's the premise. But the problem is that issues that are very big need a lot more thought. And sometimes the day-to-day / week-to-week / 2 weeks to 2 weeks Scrum cadence means that we can't think ahead far enough. This is something that I hear from a lot of folks, even in my teams today, even the ones that are working with patterns that make it possible. And the truth of the matter is simply that when you've got your heads down in a backlog and you're trying to work in a 2-week or 1 week cadence, it's hard to poke your head up and think about the big picture. Designing incrementally is something that is absolutely keen for adding value to users quickly, but it has its challenges. And as you guys already know, if you've attended a couple of the other seminars today, there are lots of different solutions to this. So today we're going to talk about just one of them. And before we go there, I want to talk about a little problem with Agile that I think we all know. This here is a picture that was produced by Henrik Knieberg, I want to say about 3 to 5 years ago. It started to go viral on the web, and it's been used as an explanation of how Agile is supposed to work in hundreds of presentations. I've seen it in 2 boardroom decks myself, and I think that this might be the source of a lot of the frustration that we as designers feel. If you're not familiar with it, what it's basically saying is that the, quote, wrong way to do Agile is one in which you're developing little increments of value that actually only have value when they all work together, as opposed to trying to develop increments of value that are standalone. In Sprint 1, for instance, as you can see from the image here, developing a skateboard might be a piece of incremental value that someone could use. Maybe they wouldn't be happy with it, but as you progress sprint to sprint, you're adding new features, transforming the interface, transforming the feature set, and eventually at the end, you get to something that's really great. Of course, as designers know, the real problem with this particular image and progression is somewhere between number 4 and number 5, where we see a motorcycle becoming a car. Because at the end of the day, the difference between a motorcycle and a car is something that someone had to plan out and think about way ahead of time. And it's ludicrous to think that if you're sitting at sprint number 4 with a motorcycle, between that and sprint number 5 delivery, you're going to figure out fuel injection, you're going to figure out camshafts, you're going to figure out axle alignment, you're going to figure out 4-wheel drive chains, and that's just going to happen based on the knowledge that you made in sprints 1, 2, 3, 4 possible. Now, the problem with this particular challenge for us is that we're under pressure to at least pretend that this is the reality of the situation. But in our heart of hearts, everyone knows, including product people and design people, that someone had to think about how a car worked somewhere before sprint 5. Otherwise, this would simply not be possible. Now, Henrik himself has written an explanation article about this image, and I actually encourage you to go online and take a look at it, in which he kind of admits that he effed up on this and basically delivered a metaphor that was incomplete. He actually argues a couple of the extremes that we'll be talking about a little bit later on, but what he's basically saying is that this isn't supposed to be a literal translation in which there's a giant transformation from number 4 to number 5. It's really about the idea that every piece of incremental value that you add is standalone and that you can have big leaps between the different increments. He's not saying that there can't be investigation or forethought in each sprint. And indeed, as we all know, all of us who have used Agile, it's practically impossible to do the purest form of Agile without being a little bit dishonest. The truth is that even if we're taking stories into a sprint that add an incremental piece of value, we're thinking about them ahead of time already. And in the truest form of Agile, that's effort. So we're expending effort to think ahead in any case. What we're trying to avoid is the waterfall, which is the picture above. And that's really what this image is supposed to delineate. It's not about the idea that you have to be strictly cohesive and make giant jumps and leaps from sprint to sprint that really could entail a ton of work. It's just saying don't chain together your value propositions from sprint to sprint such that if you had to stop in sprint 3, you have something that's completely unusable. At least make it so that if you're stopping in sprint 3, there's something that has enough value to be standalone. And I think that that's just an important thing to revisit. Anyone who's not familiar with this image, or at least the stuff that I've said, let's do some questions later on. But I think this is a nugget that really must be understood before we can even talk about how design should work in Agile in general. So moving on. I was dragged kicking and screaming into Agile, but I realized, like all of you probably have, that at some point you need to educate yourself about the enemy in order to actually engage them. And so I was very fortunate to live in Boston at the time that I kind of embraced Agile, and there I found Jeff Sutherland, who's one of the original creators of Scrum. And I attended some of his classes and worked with him pretty closely. And he began to teach me kind of the philosophy of the incremental value system. I thought that I was doing great. And in learning about that incremental value system, I encountered spikes. Many of you probably know what spikes are, but for those of you who do not, the idea of the spike is generally that you're going to, in your sprints, that is not really estimatable and that doesn't produce value. And since what you're pointing is the value to be produced, sometimes you're going to have a special entity called a spike that lets you investigate something. The main nuance of a spike is that it is always time-boxed. You don't try to estimate it in general, although some people have tried and failed spectacularly. It's saying, hey, out of this 1 week sprint, we're going to take, for instance, a 1-day spike or a 2-day spike to really think about a problem. When I discovered spikes, I thought that I'd stumbled onto like the city of gold. I was like, aha, this is where UX can fit. Not just visual design, not just interface design, but the head thinking, the forethought, the deep inquiry that we need. And in fact, I had some luck using that. And as I began to use this more and more, one thing that I discovered was that I was getting pretty good, and so were my teams, at using spikes to move ahead and think cohesively about bigger issue projects. Now, the problem with these spikes is they began to expand, right? A 1-day spike in a 1 week sprint is no big deal. But as I began to ask for more and more time in spikes, I realized that there were a few things that were suboptimal, but I was still moving forward. And I started to think about whether or not we could have a special type of spike called a design spike, because the spikes that you and I encounter on a day-to-day basis are technology spikes. They're meant to be illustrative or inquisitive of technology layering, things that developers have to figure out. So why not something just for designers? And as I began to use the methodology more and more, I realized that this had something to it, but I began to experiment with the idea of the spike actually being more than time-boxed, maybe potentially replacing the whole sprint. Of course, you guys may know already about design sprints. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But this is a little bit different because it does not have a cohesive set of things that you must do. There's no actually explicitly delineated sectionality to a day-by-day breakdown of a design spike. So I was feeling pretty good about spikes in general, and as Jerry mentioned, I wrote an article for Smashing Magazine in which I tried to take a few new steps. And this is one of the pieces from the article that I talked about, and I want to be really blatant on this. When I came up with this particular model, I thought it was going to solve all my problems. But as soon as I delivered it, I realized that I'd actually created some problems of my own that were going to break down the entire system of design spikes and of the Agile team if I continued. So by just giving you a little overview here, essentially what I was proposing at the time was that at some point, the regular sprint pauses, and then the entire team will engage in a design spike, which could have its own sprints within them. I was arguing at the time that that spike could be anywhere from 1 to even 10 weeks long, and this would be a period of dedicated inquiry into the issue. Then, of course, I was postulating that those duties and responsibilities and even programming bits that didn't require the spike work could just continue in the background. For any of you guys who are Agile dyed-in-the-wool, you know that this causes quite a lot of problems. And in fact, it did. So the idea of this original Design Spike 1.0 became very convoluted, and essentially what we figured out was that by introducing a new pattern that was outside of the normal Scrum cadence, we're actually breaking all the value of Scrum down. So I made some adjustments, and my basic point of view here was to keep it very simple. What is a spike? It's a period of inquiry in which you look into a problem, it is time-boxed, and it can have literally anything inside of it. And we should be aggressively using spikes in general, not just for design, but also for tech debt, also for inquiry at the product level, perhaps even for research. And so basically going minimalist, I eliminated all the different configuration nodes that made this a problematic thing. What we're left with here is a very simple process by which, in a backlog, during a sprint, designers, the PO, perhaps researchers if they're on board, maybe the developers, pull in a spike with a very specific time box and a very specific goal. This can include research. This can include prototyping. It can include customer inquiry. It can include, heck, just time to talk with stakeholders. Whatever you use it for, it's not a problem. And really the only revelation that's buried in this is the fact that we should be reusing the modular components that Scrum and even Kanban in some cases already provide for us instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. The reason I want to kind of harp on this is that as designers, we are always trying to solve problems with the things we see in the world. And I think that when designers first engage Agile, they see Agile as a problem as well. And so we take the lattice work that is Agile, which is very simple and made to be very modular, and we try to reconfigure it to work for our purposes. And to be really honest, I think that all good product designers who think ahead kind of live in a waterfall world. We think of big ideas and then try to maybe slice them up and deliver them to teams. It's not something that everyone does, but I think internally that's our instinct, and it gives us a lot more control. But at the end of the day, doing that means kind of recidivating into the dark side of waterfall. We might call it Agile, some people call it Scrumfall, but at the end of the day, if we really want to develop value incrementally, we have to work within the constraints of the system that's there today. So, in the last couple of years, there's been a new iteration of spikes called functional spikes. And if you are working in a high-functioning Agile team, you may have already heard of these. But essentially, functional spikes are less theory, less inquiry. They might be more about prototyping, user interface mockups. They could be about talking with users. They are very similar to the original proposition of spikes that I delivered a few years ago. Design spikes really are just a type of functional spike. Now, if you're not familiar with functional spikes, I could go into them here a little bit, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. But I would say go online and educate yourself a bit on what functional spikes can offer, because they solve many of the problems that you and I as designers will have. And essentially, earmarking one of these functional spikes as a design spike makes a heck of a lot of sense in an Agile world. On a day-to-day basis, as we're proceeding along our work, we should be grooming backlogs and starting to put hypotheses and stories into backlogs about unanswered questions, things that we think the user will want. Each of those should translate into an area of inquiry, and when we agree with the PO on the prioritization, we would call for a design spike, which is essentially a functional spike, to delve deep into this one question or maybe concentrated group of questions, with the intended output being the reduction of risk, an estimatable set of stories, and yes, even though it could be a little bit waterfally, maybe some high-level mockups. The one thing that you really want to avoid when you're doing a spike, though, is using it as an excuse not to engage with your team. Although spikes can be specialized, one of the things that we see as an anti-pattern that keeps emerging over and over again is the spike is used as an excuse to go off into our corner as designers, design the world, and then throw it over the fence at the developers. That is not the point. The point of the spike is to win you time that is not about building the thing you're building, but rather thinking about the thing that you're going to build. And I would urge you guys, if you use this methodology, which is very, very simple, to not think of it as pre-work, not to think of it as a UX story that then leads to the implementation story that developers have to do. It really should just be about taking a thing that you need to think about and figuring out what it is that you want to do at a very strategic level. The output should be predefined when you take on a spike. You should agree with your team and the product owner what the output will look like. Now, in some lower functioning Agile teams, your development team may in fact say, hey guys, we would love it if you would just give us the full specs at the end of the spike. I urge you to resist this temptation. Inevitably, what will happen is that you will start to be making yourself an outsider, someone who's disconnected from the development process. Ideally, what the spike does is give you some time to illustrate to your team and work with your team about concerning what it is that you think you want to deliver, potentially test that idea, and get the input from the team as you're going along. At the end of a spike, what you ought to have is maybe a story map, maybe a set of stories that are estimable, and in being estimable, that means that they may have wireframes, prototypes, or visual mocks. But what it should not be is a document that dictates everything that the development team needs to do next. In fact, when the development team pulls that story into the sprint, and you should be part of that development team, that is when you would actually deliver any final mocks that are required, because you should be working with the development team to deal with all the nuances that you know you're going to miss, all the details that you didn't consider, all the little things that will affect the interface, and that essentially will mean any pre-work you've done needs to change. This is all about true agility and the fact that you cannot pre-plan what you do not know, and we have to be open to bending like a reed in the wind and not breaking like an oak in the wind. So where have I used this methodology? At Constant Contact, one of the great success stories is our email editor. Now, Constant Contact has had a lot of headwinds recently, obviously, with MailChimp, which makes an excellent product as well. But one of the larger teams we have is the email editor team. And that email editor, which has been was coded in Galileo originally, is considered the industry best standard. It has been going through evolutions after evolutions for 4 years now. And over a course of I think the last 2 to 3 years, we've been doing more and more inquiry and comparisons against other editors in the market, and the data is showing, at least strongly for us, that people really like our editor and that it's providing a lot of value up front. This editor is a piece of complex software. It has a lot of different features. It has a lot of different obstacles for good design, and it has a lot of different nuances really baked into the idea that the demographic that uses this needs a constrained set of parameters to work in, but needs a lot of functionality made really easy. And the team that has been building this is a very large team consisting of 2 Scrum teams, sometimes 3 that we augment it with, and 1 to 2 lead designers who are fully embedded on these teams. The way that they've been using design spikes is very much as I've discussed. In the backlog, areas of inquiry get surfaced. The product owner and the rest of the team decide to prioritize certain spikes. They pull them into the sprint, and what you'll find there is what we call the triumvirate of the product owner, the designer, and the dev lead kind of leading the charge and thinking about these areas, but also pulling on the dev team constantly for their opinions and talking about reducing the uncertainty and building the ideas that are coming out of that triumvirate. And once the spike is done, usually there's a set of user stories as well as something that you might call a light mock-up. Could be anywhere from a sketch, literally on a whiteboard that we take a picture of, to a near full visual comp if it's particularly complex and the developers need some certainty in actually doing the work. And it moves into the sprint process. And in the sprint process, the designer, as well as the PO, as well as the tech lead that originally worked on it, since they're part of the team, and that is a core assumption of this, they're there to answer questions and make modifications. Nothing is written in stone. Essentially, it's a very flexible frame for someone to work in when the uncertainty of a certain situation is pretty high, but it also provides that time box certainty that some work will be done by the end of whatever the allocated time is, and that allocation provides the business with the certainty that it really is lacking when we're talking about waterfall. So that's a long, long way of saying that design spikes are the way of no way at all. There is absolutely no prescribed inclusion process-wise in a spike. It's a bubble of time. It's a bubble of time in which a team of developers, designers, the product owner, maybe even QE, are dedicating themselves to thinking about a problem. They're giving themselves a limit of time because they don't want this to go on forever, and they're agreeing ahead of time what is the acceptance criteria for this design spike to be done. In essence, they're giving themselves a moment to think and a moment to reach certainty. And that criteria can include abstract things like getting stakeholder input. It can include user testing. It can include prototyping, and it can even include live code if you're able to do some really fancy A/B split testing with a small segment. If you don't, if you're willing to take that risk, which we can talk about a little bit later. So I would love to sit here and tell you that the spike is a rigid framework with a prescribed set of hours and days and exercises that everyone should do in section 1, and then they move to section 2 where hypotheses are tested, and section 3 where we do prototyping, section 4 where we finally go into user testing. But in reality, no real Agile situation can survive in a prescribed manner, because Agile rests on the assumption that every week is different, and that the need that you have one week will be different the next week, and the goal that you have one month could be different the next month. And using the same prescribed formula over and over again is a sure way to make yourself rework formulas. So what I'm trying to say here is design sprints aren't good enough. I know if you're attending this seminar, you've probably watched a couple of the really excellent design sprint presentations. I know C. Todd Lombardo, a friend of mine who actually worked with me at Constant Contact and helped develop his own methodology for design sprints, had an excellent presentation on this earlier. And what I'm saying is that design sprints are actually quite good, but they are not sufficient for a true Agile organization. They should be used, but why aren't they good enough? They have a prescriptive format. And the truth is that you're going to have questions that come up for which a design sprint is too big. If you just need to do a little bit of inquiry and prototyping that you could do in 4 or 5 hours, maybe a full sprint isn't needed. Now, that's not saying that all sprints have to be a week long. Obviously, CTOD and also the folks at Google have come up with modified versions as well that work perfectly fine. But sometimes a little spike can be literally half a day. It could be an hour. There's no telling what you can fit inside of them. Secondarily, velocity impact. If you're working in a highly tuned Agile environment, probably the folks in the company care a lot about their velocity charts, even though they shouldn't be misusing them that way. They care a lot about predictability. They may even care a lot about making sure that there's a certain percentage of time allocated to execution as opposed to spikes in general. And so doing design sprints as your primary way of getting around the Agile UX problem is kind of limiting. That's not to say they shouldn't be used. It's just to say that they've got problems in the long term if you're constantly using them. They're disruptive to iteration, especially small incremental iteration, and they're simply not sustainable if you're using them on a week-to-week basis. We've struggled with this quite a lot, and I'm a huge fan of design sprints, but I see them more as a tool to be used, say, quarterly, or when you begin a large new epic, when you're needing to do a lot of focused work on something that's quite big to eliminate some hypotheses, hypothetical questions that you haven't grappled with yet. On a sprint-to-sprint basis, you need something that's a little bit smaller and a little bit more flexible. So go ahead and use design sprints. They're great. But one of the tricks you can use to make these both work together is simply put the design sprints inside of a spike. Again, the spike is just a time box. It's nothing more. You can say, hey, we're going to take a giant design spike this coming sprint. We're going to dedicate the next week to a design sprint. Totally fine. The main thing is to know at the end what it is that you need to get out of the actual spike, and to understand that that is a piece of sacrificial velocity that you're gonna actually give away in order to look into a problem, and that's fine. Any mature Agile organization will understand the value. But here's where we get to the big guns. So what if you're not just one small team? What if, on a day-to-day basis, you find that you've got large coordinated issues that you have to work across multiple teams? And what if dependencies are an ongoing issue? Well, the good news is that spikes themselves, because they're so flexible, can kind of absorb other patterns on top of themselves. And what I'm talking about here is dual track Agile. Now, this may be a new concept to a lot of you. Some of you may know about it, but it bears talking about for about 5 minutes at least to give you some idea of what this is. Dual track Agile is a methodology that has come out of the West Coast, mostly in the startup culture, and has percolated over to the East Coast as well. Many of you guys may use it. Jeff Patton, of course, was one of the original proponents of it. And what it basically says is that you can divide your backlog into 2 different sections. You have to be very careful to avoid waterfall, but essentially you can have a backlog that has a discovery section as well as a delivery section. Now, the temptation here is to do all of your design in the discovery section, and then to go through a series of processes that, again, lead to basically a waterfall handoff. But what is actually argued in this model is that the discovery backlog simply contains all the things that you have to do to attain certainty and to understand the problem very well. Now, a methodology that I agree with and that a lot of folks who use dual track Agile are proponents of is the idea that you essentially could have 2 boards for the same backlog. One board is a Kanban board, the discovery backlog. The reason it's a Kanban board is each column in the Kanban world could be a time-boxed requirement. It could be a different phase that you go through on the way to attaining certainty. But most importantly, it's a very visible place in which you can show what it is that you're inquiring into and in which you can track progress. I won't go into the specifics of what might be in one of these boards, but I'll give you an example. Oftentimes, we'll see a model like this, where the discovery backlog is where you do things like stakeholder interviews, user research, persona, scenarios, and story mapping. Some people say that rapid prototyping belongs in the delivery backlog. I personally think they can go to the discovery backlog as well. But essentially, if you think about it, each column in the discovery backlog Kanban area is itself a type of spike. You can time box it and say that for this particular increment, we're going to take 4 days on stakeholder interviews. We're going to take X amount of days on user research. And as your epics or stories begin to move from left to right on the Kanban board, they're becoming more and more certain. Each one of these potential actions that you can take towards resolving the discovery backlog is not mandatory. Again, this is one of the big differences between using a spike and an actual defined design sprint. You can simply skip over parts that you don't need. And as you're spiking your way towards certainty, the only thing that matters is the triumvirate of the PO, the actual dev lead, and the designer, as well as the rest of the team, decide at the end of whatever amount of spikes you're taking that they've reached the level of certainty that qualifies something to move into the delivery backlog. And once it's in the delivery backlog, well, you're not off the hook as the designer. You still have to provide value and potentially mock-ups there, and as well as guidance and maybe some usability testing. But at least you've gotten to the point where you're pretty sure of what you're doing. It bears saying that the discovery backlog, which is the place where all of your design spikes would live, has to have a subset of the team guarding it, prioritizing it, and working through it. It could be the whole team, but that can get really messy. As long as you're transparent with the whole team and delivering the value in the same ceremonies in which you're working with your Scrum, so backlog grooming sessions and demos, it's okay for a subset of the team to be more focused on that discovery backlog. And my proposed subset, and the one that I think most people are using nowadays, is the product owner, the UX lead, and the dev lead. We call it the iron triumvirate here. Some people just call it the triad. But it's essentially the folks who are responsible for thinking ahead and that have to add a little bit more value than just the implementation phase. So you've heard this basic framework now, and you might be wondering, gosh, there must be a lot of details and rules about it. Or you might be saying, hey, that seems like a disorganized mess. How can I learn a little bit more about the specifics? So I'm really happy to go into that, and I'm hoping in the Q&A we'll have some time to discuss potential ways that you could format your discovery backlog, as well as use the spikes. But it's really important to remember that we need to be realistic as designers and understand that just like the product world is fluid and the marketing world is fluid, the needs of the Agile team are fluid as well. And we can define any process in the world, including spikes, including sprints, and know that really we're never going to attain the perfect version of that. At best, we're going to create a tool that lets us move ahead and that gets us more gains and more wins than we would not have, otherwise. What I would say, though, is one of the things I've really struggled with as a designer myself is the idea that I want to fix a problem and I can't let go until it is fully fixed. But that itself is antithetical to the Agile manifesto and the Agile mindset. It's okay to make incremental improvements. And for what it's worth, I think that design spikes are an incremental improvement. They're not a cure-all. Nothing that I present, that CTOD presents, that anyone else presents will make a difference if you have a sickness in your culture, if you have teams that don't actually want to embrace the mindset of Agile, if you have folks who are not into the product and care passionately about it. No methodology will solve that. The only thing that spikes will solve is the idea that you need to think ahead and consider your options and validate. They'll give you breathing room and hopefully a framework through which you and your cohort, your team, your coworkers on your UX team, as well as the dev team, will be able to focus on a real hairy issue for a long time and come out the other end feeling pretty certain about what you want to do. But at the end of the day, if your teams aren't interested in doing the right thing, or if they're so dysfunctional that you can't even get them to attend normal rituals and ceremonies, this is not going to solve that problem. This problem is for designers who need to think big and have to do it in the methodology that moves fast, which is Agile. So now it's your turn. I want to emphasize that this is a very lightweight framework, and combined with dual track Agile, you're going to find that design spikes will solve a great many problems that you have. But the truth is that you're going to have to locally optimize for your situation. And there's nothing that I can tell you that will say, hey, specifically X, Y, and Z will certainly work for your Agile team. That's going to come through your own practice, your own development of your own, if you will, fighting style with your own development teams. And it's going to come through your own mastery of the situation. I want to note that I have no stake in this game. I'm not selling a book. I'm not a consultant. I'm a person who runs a large UX organization with a lot of different brands who try to run Agile a lot of different ways. And my interest in this is really to just add back to the community and solve some problems that everyone might be having. I'm not going to make any cash off of this particular methodology, and I'm not going to claim credit for it either. What I do hope, though, is that you'll try it out and try to combine, if you're in a fast, small team, the idea of design spikes with, if you're feeling a little bit aggressive and a little bit ambitious, the idea of dual track Agile. Because what I think you're going to find is if you can avoid the temptation to fall into a default waterfall, it's a great way to think through really big problems and address a lot of stakeholder concerns about how do we pre-think issues that could strategically be important but not break the Scrum cadence. That is what I've got, guys. So I want to make sure we reserved at least 20 minutes, hopefully more like 25, because the devil is in the details, and this methodology is so light that you'd have to actually think about all the different use cases where you might implement it. I'm really happy to talk about some wins and fails that we've had on this. But I think the most important takeaway is that I can tell you it's flexible enough that we've had far more wins than fails, but it's also dangerous and might make you want to slip back into a waterfall methodology, which will bite you in the butt eventually, and I hope you can avoid it. Jerry?
Yeah, thank you so much, Damon. That was great. And yeah, we have about a half hour here for Q&A, so we have plenty of time. Before we dive into it, since we won't get through all the questions, drop a link there for Product Tribes, which is our Slack group. If you have more than 3 years of experience in a product team, feel free to apply there. We've got quite a few people in there. And I will also launch this poll, since we always have new people joining each session. And let's dive into some of the questions. We've got some great ones here. So the first question is a fairly simple one, I suppose, which is there a difference between a time box and a spike? So this person at their company, they are doing time boxes over a few days to evaluate features or UI ideas. Is that the same as doing a design spike?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a little bit more formality that is kind of bundled up instead of a spike. So first of all, I should mention that in the Agile world, and you guys probably know some of this, spikes are a little bit controversial because a lot of Agile purists believe that incremental addition of value is the sole purpose of the Scrum. Um, so you might be in a place where they're essentially using the wording time box instead of spike, but what they really do mean is a spike. More formally, though, one of the differences is that the spike has a specific output or a specific piece of knowledge that's going to be acquired. And for functional spikes, including design spikes, it would be a very specific piece of output. And I would urge you to make that estimatable stories with anything that is required to make those story estimatable, as well as the basic criteria by which your team can achieve stakeholder certainty or at least stakeholder support. So I think the short answer is that it really could be the same thing, but if you're going to be doing this at the enterprise level or at a startup that is looking to actually validate pretty harsh ideas, or at least ideas that are controversial, then having the formality around saying, hey, it's not just a time box, we actually have a specific output we're going to take into consideration is helpful. So when you take the spike into the sprint, just like you would with the user story, have acceptance criteria, and that is probably the main differentiator.
Gotcha. And someone here is curious, could you give an example of a design spike used in the discovery track versus one used in the delivery track? Is there any difference between how that might play out?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're in the discovery track, what you're hoping to do if you're using that dual track agile model is to kind of bifurcate your efforts so that the development team is not having to do work for which it is not optimized for, but is fully kept in the loop. So for instance, I would use stakeholder interviews as an example, right? The developers themselves, the development team, and when I say that, by the way, I include the designer in that, although that's somewhat controversial. It's probably suboptimal for the developer or the team of developers to be going and having stakeholder interviews with VPs in your company, product owners, and other parts of the company to understand what they have in their head, especially for the whole team to do that. But that is definitely something you'd want to do in a discovery phase because it's kind of setting yourself up for success. That's something that is more optimized for the designer, the PO, the dev lead or tech lead, if you have such a thing, to be looking into. And they would bring that back into the actual same ceremonies that are happening during the normal sprint, sharing that information during things like grooming ceremonies, during demos, all that would mesh and intermingle. It wouldn't be something that would be completely separate. I think that that's a point worth hitting on. Just because the discovery backlog is separate does not mean that the reporting and idea sharing is separate. That would all still be munched together in the actual Scrum ceremonies as well. It's just that you have a different sub-team focused on these bigger questions. Now, a spike that's inside of the actual delivery cycle would be something, for instance, like where you're doing a rapid piece of live code prototype to do a quick A/B split test. So that is something that you could still characterize as a design spike, but it's got something more to do with a thing that's going to go out the door. It's not something through which you're working a question or trying to attain certainty, not necessarily anyway. It could actually have production value. Does that make sense, Jerry?
Yeah, absolutely. And someone here is also curious, in your experience, is velocity a good or bad measure for UX design outcomes?
That's controversial. I would say that it is pretty difficult to measure the quality of user interface and user experience design against velocity. I think that velocity, the way you should think of it, is not like the speed of the team, but the speed at which the team delivers value to the customer. Now, that's not exactly how most companies use it, let's be honest, right? A lot of people misuse velocity to kind of let them know how quick, quote unquote, a team is. But what it really ought to be is the measure of how quick that team is getting stuff into the hands of users who are then hopefully delighted, and if at worst case, providing feedback on what's been put out there. So I think my short answer is velocity is not really a great measure for UX output, but I think that a thing that's worth talking about is velocity really can only apply to the Scrum team itself. It can't apply to one individual on the team. And if you're in a company where they're measuring individual velocity, and that entails something like, the UX person is giving their own velocity as opposed to having a united velocity with the team itself, there's probably something wrong, or at least questionable about the Scrum implementation. And it means that folks are putting a different value permission set around the UX designer from the development team, and that can be really problematic.
Right. And someone here is curious, have you ever had to adapt a design spike for remote teams? And if so, what adjustments or tactics did you find were useful for that?
Yeah, they actually have to do this all the time, unfortunately. For a design spike, it depends on if you're doing it in the freestanding format or in the discovery backlog format. The discovery backlog format is actually a lot more useful for remote teams because if you're using a Kanban structure with specific areas of inquiry or motions of inquiry, it's easier to align yourself, especially if you have time zone differences, right? I can get up in the morning and see that maybe a researcher in Bangalore has done an inquiry and I can go and review that work. They've moved it to the next area of the Kanban board, and then I can grab it and work with them. But I would say there's no real solution to co-location other than having meetings wherever you can overlap and sharing information constantly. Again, that's kind of like the dark magnet of anything that isn't pure Scrum, the idea that somehow we can get back into our silos, get our heads down, just work on it ourselves, and then pass it off. That is the very definition of waterfall. And to avoid that, even if you're doing a spike, you have to make sure that the information is being shared either through a video conference or phone contact or constant emails. Kind of the fidelity of that contact is going to be related very directly to the quality of your output. So if you're continents away, I would say try for a lot of video conferencing. Do this very regularly. If you have to, one of our teams, we have a mobile team that works via India and then also Massachusetts. They actually keep a large TV that's always on webcam, and they can see the other team constantly. They just walk over and knock on the TV and then talk to each other when they have to. That's not always possible, but hey, we're on a video conference right now. It's 2017. It's easy enough to hit up a Hangouts and talk to someone in person if you need to.
Right. And someone here is also curious about how do you handle documentation and also maintaining the scope of a design spike. So do you rely on product owners or product managers to help, or is UX sort of expected to drive the the sizing and the documentation and all of those processes?
That's a really good question. Is it possible to ask a follow-up question to the person who asked that, Jerry?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering if they're more interested in the framework with the dual track Agile, or if they're talking about just a small team where there's just maybe one designer involved and they're spiking on their way. But I can kind of talk about both scenarios, and if that person has a specific question inside of there, I'll address it.
Yeah, that works.
I would say that. Okay, first of all, if you're really worried about documentation, it depends on what exactly that documentation is. So when you take on a spike, again, it should be off of a backlog in either case, right? Either a discovery backlog or your normal backlog. That story or ticket, whatever you want to call it, if you're using Jira, which is a nightmare, but everyone uses it. I'm just kidding. The Atlassian folks have done great things in the last year. That ticket should include the criteria that you're looking to hit. And that would be kind of saying, what exactly is it that I need at the end to say that we've achieved the goal? Documentation, right, is an anti-pattern in Scrum. In fact, the Agile and in Agile in general, the Agile Manifesto is really clear that it prefers working code and information to documentation. And in a world where UX folks have to hand off really deep, 20, 30-page PDF documents with all the possible use cases described, that's already pointing to something that's suboptimal that has very little to do with Spike, right? Because what an Agile philosopher would say is, instead of you telling me the 3 different use cases in a piece of paper and doing a lot of line graphs with arrows saying use case 1, X, Y, and Z, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what we prefer is for you to come over to my cube and let's talk about it, and I'll take some notes and we'll figure it out together. So I'm bristling a little bit at the idea of needing documentation, but if you're talking about the idea of making sure that we're writing down the findings, that we're understanding the set of things that we need to actually hit in order to say that we're certain about moving forward for a story, then that has to be the combined responsibility of that triad. It's the PO, it's the designer, and the most senior dev person, ideally a dev lead. Because you need at least one representative of each leg of the product stool to make sure that you have enough information to move forward. The PO is going to really understand the business requirements, or at least should. They might be aware of stakeholder concerns. The product designer will have to understand the limitations, the personas involved, the idealized interface, the experience that's trying to be hit, and the dev lead will be that real dose of reality about what can be pulled off that wouldn't be sub-performant, that can actually be built in a reasonable amount of time. If you're feeling that urge to take it on yourself and you really want to control that, that documentation, and you think it's your decision, you're probably having some norming problems with your team. And that goes back to my point from the presentation, which is these spikes will help with that, especially if you put a lattice work around it, like the triumvirate, like the discovery backlog. But at the end of the day, if you're not in a situation where at least you and the PO and hopefully the dev lead feel like you're bound at the hip and working towards the same ends, this won't overcome it, and nothing else will either, other than building that relationship.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That sounded highly philosophical, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. And the next question here is, so would you say that the concept of velocity is even really relevant in the discovery phase, or rather discovery track, or is that more for the delivery track?
Great question. Velocity is completely irrelevant in the discovery track. The only thing that matters is the time boxing. Having a sense of how long you're going to take on something is really the key. If you are measuring velocity in the discovery track, it's probably not something that's suitable for your use, because at the end of the day, the discovery track is about uncertainty, right? So if I ask you, hey, how long is it going to take to get to the corner 7-Eleven? You can tell me that, and we can estimate how fast you're going to move, and I'll be able to know that if you get there in a certain amount of time, I've got your velocity. But if I turn around to you and say, hey, tell me how long it's going to take to get to my brother's house, which you don't know, you're going to have to discover that as you go along. And if I'm measuring your velocity on an uncertain goal, that velocity is meaningless, because as you're moving along, you're having to constantly pivot, learn new things, adjust what you're doing, slow down, speed up. The velocity becomes a total abstraction. If you want to know some brick and mortar ways to make this work, for instance, in Jira, a way to do this is to have an issue type in your backlog, label some tickets as being discovery and some tickets as being not discovery. Only pull the discovery tickets into the Kanban board and just ignore velocity on those. It won't be useful. And really, who's measuring the speed at which you're inquiring into something? The point is to have really great output and understanding, and that can't be measured in time, although you can time box the effort.
Right. And actually, speaking of time, we had a couple questions here. It's sort of a theme I'm seeing in questions, which is, sometimes you're working on a tight deadline and you're trying to fit in enough time for people to get involved in a design spike, especially because it's a multidisciplinary effort. For you guys, how do you plan and resource for a design spike? Do you sort of assume that during that whole spike, all the developers and the product managers are going to be dedicating all of their time to that spike, or how does that play out for you?
Great question. So it is just like any other user story, potentially. It's negotiable. So when you put the spec into the backlog, theoretically ahead of time, you and the product owner and the rest of the team, you should be grooming deeply into the backlog, all things being ideal, and of course it's not always ideal, and really writing down what it is that spike's trying to accomplish and what level of effort you think it's going to require. When you pull a spike into a sprint, that's a ceremony in which the entire team is agreeing that it's something worth doing. And if the team is pulling it in and it's got some time box attached to it, for instance, hey, we need to do 5 days on this, what is basically being said there is that the team agrees that you should be taking 5 days, and that whatever subset is required is going to take 5 days. Now, I'm detecting in the question potentially this idea of deadline. So that's an unusual thing, but probably reality, in that it's in most organizations that are trying to run Agile, it's the team that tells the organization when something will be delivered. It's not the organization that tells the team by when it needs to be delivered. The basic premise of that Agile flow, which again, it's some places don't do it the right way or do it in a way that's suboptimal, is that the team knows better how long it will take to accomplish something. So getting back to the actual question, no, the full team is not required. The spike itself, just like if someone were taking a spike to learn Perl, it doesn't mean the entire team needs to learn Perl. So if you're taking a design spike into a sprint, all that is required is that the team fully knows what's going on. It's been prioritized. The parameters of the actual time box have been established. The output is understood, as far as goal criteria go, and then the team collectively pulls it in. Again, I should point out that this is assuming that the Scrum teams are highly functional and cross-functional as well. If you're talking about a situation where you just have an independent Scrum team of designers who are just designing, you probably shouldn't be using Scrum anyway. That's more of a Kanban thing. But long story short, no, it's not everyone is required. It's just that everyone can negotiate the parameters, and the PO, the designer, and the dev lead have the ultimate say.
Right. And going back to the dual track agile process, when you joined Constant Contact, did you find that you had to really sell this process, or was it something that was already built into the culture and the life cycle there? And if you did have to sell it, what did you find was useful for getting people on board with the dual track process?
So the dual track process is something that was certainly not in the DNA of folks. And we've only used it at specifically Constant Contact a few times. We're using it more at the enterprise level for these bigger, hairier problems that cross-cut multiple platforms. That's not to say I don't intend to deploy it more often at Constant Contact, but I think the question that's being asked, did you have to sell it? Yes, absolutely. There's actually a danger in using it in general. So if your organization is just starting Agile, you can take dual track Scrum and use it as a great excuse to go back to waterfall. Because if you are feeling that you want to do it this way, you can use that discovery backlog as the place where you quote do all your documentation ahead of time, right? It's really easy to fall into that. And for some organizations, to be frank, that aren't going to ever achieve like a full Agile methodology, or that just don't have the DNA to move that quick, either through legacy tech debt or just through cultural norms, maybe that's okay. But it's a fairly new concept to many companies, even though it's been around for a couple of years. The main resistance has always been, oh, gee, that seems more complicated. But I guarantee you, if you give it a shot, one thing you're going to figure out is that the stuff you're doing in discovery, you're kind of shoehorning into your normal Scrum process anyway, and you're just not calling it that. And it's an awkward fit, and you're probably struggling already with like, oh, I've got this work I need to do, and I don't know how to point it, and I don't know who's on board, and when can I deliver it, and am I being perceived as a bottleneck? These are all issues that are resolved by that, and you're going to address that in any case, so you might as well give it a shot. One of the things I always urge people to do, though, is find a safe time in which to do it. The good news about the dual track Agile is it does not interrupt the sprint work at all. Everything that your normal your sprinting team is doing can stay exactly the same. All it's saying is that we also have this other shadow backlog that at least 3 of us, the PO, the designer, and the tech lead, are going to talk about every week. And we're going to have little bits of work in there, and we're going to take those on to eliminate uncertainty. And maybe this stuff doesn't even have to appear on the backlog that is the sprint backlog, but you guys do it in an incremental fashion and you plan ahead of time. It's really just a way of organizing the initial inquiry so that it is following a basic process that you can track, and that makes it more negotiable for the UX designer to reach kind of a level of certainty that they think is appropriate for the use case at hand, without it just being a random thing where you're trying to shoehorn it into a spike that's ahead of you, or sorry, a sprint that's ahead of you.
Yeah. And let's see here. The next question is, this is tied into what you were talking about with, dual track being almost a dangerous in a way because you can fall back into waterfall. But if somebody is in the early stages of Agile, are there certain stages or progressions or that they should move through first to get traditional Scrum figured out first before they move to dual track Agile?
So I don't think that there's any cut and dry answer to that. My instinct is yes. What I would say is the basics that you need, the things that dual track won't solve. You got to already be in a place where people prioritize work in a backlog, and where it is understood that sometimes the work will be thinking about stuff and not building stuff. You also need to be in a place where the product owner is advanced and fluid enough to realize that part of his or her job is to think about big questions ahead of time, and that they're going to also have the product designer be on board with that. If you're looking for a way to see if you can get it in earlier before you have a natural maturity cycle that allows this to happen, there are actually a couple of shortcuts you can do, which is to just insist on a couple of basic things. For instance, you can say, we're going to do this discovery process, but I will never deliver visual comps. that you can just simply say that is not part of the discovery process. That will always be what we do in the normal Scrum process. And taking a little shortcut like that kind of ensures that you're not going to be held accountable for a waterfall mentality. You're always setting the expectation that what comes out of the discovery backlog is information, not direction. And that can help. And that can actually get you to a point where if you can get your triumvirate on board, it's probably a lot easier to make the case, and it ensures that you won't be held accountable for giant mock-ups ahead of time.
Right, right. And let's see. So what are some modifications or tweaks that you have discovered as you have implemented design spikes and dual track agile? So for instance, is the way that you practice it now different than when you first started doing it at Constant Contact? And if so, what would you say are some of those, those top modifications that you had to make?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I hinted to before, when I originally wrote that article on spikes, I put in a lot of what I would call like emotional padding. So things that I was putting in to make sure that things felt like they were covered. For instance, the addition of a specific design stakeholder who would have to approve the outcome of the spike. The addition of the idea that the normal sprints would stop, so to allow room for this kind of thinking. And as we began working on it at Constant Contact, primarily through the builder team, the email builder team, what we found out was all that stuff was largely unnecessary if the relationship between the PO, the designer, and the dev lead was good. So we removed the cruft and instead went with a very, very simple mindset of when a spike like this occurs, the only real requirement is that those three folks, and that can expand, right? Your team can optimize for a different triumvirate or a different group of people, that those people agree that they're taking on a job which involves regular communication, mind melding, and kind of a unanimous agreement that whenever that work is done, it's truly done and they're ready to move on. And I think that was one of the main temptations of the original version, the idea that I could establish, or a team could establish, some objective criteria through which a thing would be gated and accepted. And what we found in practice was, well, each inquiry is different. And so what actually ends up having to happen is that you can't have an objective statement of when X is done and Y is done, the spike is a success. It's got to be something negotiated every single time. I would also say another modification that we made is to put in the expectation that the designer would be communicating kind of what is happening in the spike. A lot of times with Agile especially, you get into that mindset of like, well, I'll wait for the demo. The demo is when I see the outcome and then I provide my feedback, and that is the way that Scrum is supposed to run. But there's no reason that in the inquiry phase and the discovery phase that can't be different. It's actually probably beneficial to have more feedback, to get stakeholders involved earlier during that phase, and simply to get their input without the parameters of the demo. That means the information would still have to be demoed during the traditional demo, but there's nothing that should keep you from being more agile in sharing what's going on. And I think finally the main thing was fluidity, right? Over and over, I find with all of my teams, you cannot have a rigid rule set for something that is by definition fluid. And if you attempt to impose that rule set, folks will ignore it, or they will modify it, or they will simply end up breaking on it. And I had a very good designer who may in fact be on the call, so I don't want to mention this person's name, who we imposed some rigid rule sets on that kind of felt like spiking, who really buckled under that and did not like it. And it caused issues with that person's team because the team itself was not on board for the ride. And through that inflexibility, we actually guaranteed failure. It was only when we opened that up and said, hey, the spike's just a time bubble. And in that time bubble, you guys decide what you need as long as you're crisp on it and the output is exactly as described, and then you deliver that information to your team for the next phase. Then it started to open up. So my Cliff Notes version of that is, it's Jeet Kune Do. It's the way of no way. It's not about throwing a specific punch or a specific kick. It's about being fluid and kind of taking the capacity of the situation and doing what you can with it. Use the inertia of the situation to your advantage. Don't try to make the situation bend to your will.
Right, and I think that's actually a great transition into the next question, or rather theme of questions that I've seen which is, if I'm a designer working in a waterfall organization, what are some really high impact steps that I can take to try to move that team towards an agile process, without trying to, like you said, try to move against the inertia of the organization. I don't know if you found there were some really effective baby steps that you have found in your career for moving these waterfall companies towards more of an agile mindset and practice?
Oh God, I'm happy to talk about that all day long because I've done it a lot of times. The two methods that have worked best for me, and again, this is N of one, you'll have to optimize it for your company, is in waterfall companies. Actually, what ends up happening is something that is very similar to Kanban. It's just not defined, and there aren't limits like work in progress limits. Um, I have seen folks, and I myself have used Kanban boards without saying, hey, this is an agile methodology. Simply saying, oh, these are phases through which something works, which is very waterfall. And then simply kind of insisting that when something is in phase X, I'm not going to do additional work. We limit this to one thing in progress at any given time. And once folks have kind of adopted that methodology, which I actually find people are pretty open to as long as you don't put it in their face that they're doing agile, then you can revisit the idea of, this is very similar to Kanban, and here's some ways we can optimize it. This is part of the agile world, and maybe we can consider other techniques in the future and learn from those guys. Kanban has the advantage of actually being a type of waterfall to begin with. It's just a faster moving fluid waterfall that limits the amount of insanity happening at any given time. So it's much easier to make the argument for Kanban to a waterfall environment than it is to get Scrum going. However, if you want to go the Scrum route, one thing to do is to sneakily incorporate checkpoints into your waterfall process that look a lot like sprints. And it's a little bit devious, but it has worked for me and for at least two of my colleagues before, which is to say, hey, as we're working on this big project, why don't we, like, once every 2 weeks, show people how things are going, a demo, right? And invite all the people who might be interested in this and not worry too much about whether or not they like it, because if they don't like it, that's great, we'll get the feedback early. And in addition to that, why don't we every 2 weeks just revisit the work we're doing and just kind of prioritize what we should be doing for the next increment of time? It's a really interesting thing because Scrum is, in a way, like a religion and a philosophy to many people. I've used Waterfall successfully and liked it. I like Scrum a little bit better. But I think what people recoil from is the terminology. It's kind of like a tribalistic mindset, right? If you're not on board for Scrum, then if someone says, hey, try this Scrum, they push back. If on the other hand, you say, hey, let's try this methodology where we can track our work and make sure that we're all on the same page when we look at the outcome of that work, and by the way, we'll do that every week or two, I think you'll find that people will go for it.
Right. It's really all in the way that you sort of frame it to folks. And this is something that was even touched on at our last virtual conference, which was really more of, as long as you take an incremental approach to it and you sort of ease them into it and in some way almost not necessarily say that this is going to be a huge change and here's a new method, but you just introduce a few small tactics and you can even call it the same thing as you're currently doing. You have a much better chance of eventually getting them into the agile process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one thing when you're pushing for that is to figure out, where does the bottleneck come from? If the bottleneck, the resistance to Scrum, is at the development team level, you have a much, much harder situation than if there's just management disagreement with the Scrum methodology. Because the management folks, there's only just a few of them. You can introduce them to ideas. You can have one-on-one conversations. They might push back, but the rest of the team is inculcated towards it. And then if they get on board, then you'll very quickly see the opportunities evolve where you can try it. If the development team specifically simply does not believe that it can provide incremental value in a fast fashion, then you have to use some level of duplicity, unfortunately, to get them accustomed to this idea of checking in and iterating. And developers tend to be a smart bunch. They're going to maybe know what you're doing. So you have to be pretty careful and realize that it has to be presented in a way that's valuable to them. It can't be you trying to force your agenda. It has to be about kind of yoking the best practices that are out there in the ecosystem to make it easier for them, which in fact it will be.
Right. The next question here is about a point that you made earlier, which was, ideally you like to see rapid prototyping as being part of the discovery track. In your experience, has it mostly been part of the delivery track, or have you worked in some scenarios where it was part of the discovery track? And maybe you could talk about the benefits of having it be part of discovery versus being part of delivery.
Yeah, totally. So where I see it being part of discovery is when the prototype is something using maybe a great tool like UXPin, or perhaps something like an Envision, something where the prototype really isn't fully functional, but where people can interact with it and understand what it is you're trying to get across. And also when you need to produce maybe several different ideation versions of it very quickly. Maybe you have 3 different ideas and you want to explore all 3 and see how people kind of react to that. that really feels like it should be in the discovery backlog. Now, if your rapid prototyping is using something like React to create an actual interface that people can actually use, and maybe you can release it to clients and have them interact with it in the true app, then you're talking really delivery. Because at the end of the day, the real difference between the two is at the end of the discovery backlog is information and a decision. At the end of a delivery backlog is something that gets released to actual users in the wild. And you can do rapid prototyping in the wild, but if you're going to do that, it's definitely going to touch the development team. There's going to be QE issues, right? Because you're releasing something, they need to make sure that everything is compliant to code standards, to outcome standards, as well as to performance standards. If you're doing something like that and you're already tapping the rest of the development team to make sure that this is good enough to release to people, then you're in delivery anyway, because there's going to have to be work for that team to do the prototype to begin with. So before you can release your real code prototype to the world, someone's going to have to do something in their sprint to make sure that it's okay. And if you're delving into the sprint waters already, yeah, you've really gone outside of the discovery backlog.
Right, and I think since we're pushing up on the end of the hour here, we'll take the last question here, and I think this is a good sort of closing note. I saw someone here was curious. You mentioned in the talk something about falling back into waterfall. They're curious, in your experience, have you seen any sort of warning signs for when this dual track process starts to revert back to waterfall? Is there any sort of red flags that one would want to look out for when they're implementing this, and so that it's actually sustainable?
Yeah, there's a couple of magical words, which is where are the mockups? That's a good one. I need the specs. This doesn't seem fully defined. Those are my three favorite. I've heard variations of them everywhere. You really have to work hard to keep people in the mindset that the discovery backlog is an information generator and a risk reducer. It is not intended to be a sausage machine where a fully cased sausage comes out of the end that's ready to throw on the grill. What's more likely is that what comes out is ground meat, and then during the delivery backlog, that's when you form it. Sorry to all the vegetarians on the call. Generally speaking, what you have to avoid and be very wary of is that discovery backlog being a place where all the decisions are made for the development team. They need to be part of the conversation. Again, the spirit of Agile is that the team on the ground, including the programmers, including the QEs or QAs, are actually the best suited to know what can be achieved and how it might be achieved. Obviously, the UX designer owns 51% of the interface. That's kind of how we see it at the company that I work for. The PO owns 51% of the business value. The tech lead and the devs own 51% of how the code is done. So everyone's got their own little veto. But if your discovery backlog simply becomes a place where decisions are made, mock-ups are created, and basically you're finding yourself doing the old thing of like, here's my PDF, as I said before, the 50-page PDF that defines everything, boom, now it's ready for the delivery backlog, huge warning sign. The spirit of Agile is very simple. It's stop throwing things over the fence at me. Keep me in the conversation. Let me be a part of the decision-making process. And if the discovery backlog is simply a place where some of those things rest, a way to track the inquiry that you're doing, but that ultimately keeps the conversation open for the whole team, then you're doing it right. If you find that box is being used to limit the communication, to make decisions for the team, or to require from you that you have to have a mock-up or spec sheet or fully defined design at the end of it, then you're absolutely going back to the waterfall world, and you'll have to work pretty hard to get back out of it.
And I think that is a great sort of closing sentiment there, Damon. Great job. I got some feedback here in the Q&A, and people really appreciated the level of detail and insight and expertise that you brought to the topic here. They thought it was very practical, and yeah, they really enjoyed it. And to the audience too, thank you for coming with such great questions here. It's hard to believe that we are halfway through the summit here. And for everybody here, Damon, I'll send you an invite as well. If you have more than 3 years of experience on a product team, we encourage you to apply for the Slack channel, Product Tribes. We are using this as an overflow channel as well for the conference. So there's a lot of conversation going on here among the 4,000 people or so, about the topics, about the talks, and just about product development and design and engineering in general. So check it out there. And of course, let me drop in the link again this was the original article that Damon wrote on the topic. And of course, he has iterated on the design spike process since then. But this is still a great baseline and definitely touches on some of the points he covered here. But yeah, everybody, thank you so much for joining us so far. It's hard to believe we're halfway through this. But yeah, we've got some more great presentations tomorrow. Just as a quick summary, tomorrow, the morning session, we're going to have David Sherwin and Aaron Munzer, who both used to work at Frog Design. They're going to be talking about a process that they really practiced there, and also now as they have left to other corporate roles, about participatory design. So how do you get users back into this process, not just from a user research standpoint, from actually participating in the design process. And that'll be a great opening session to our day tomorrow. So hope to see you all there tomorrow. Damon, great job. And yeah, have a great rest of the afternoon and evening now.
And Jerry, thank you and UXPin for sponsoring this event. It seriously adds to the base of knowledge in the community, and there aren't enough people doing this kind of thing. So many thanks to you and your company. I know it's a lot of work, but there's a lot of people who depend on this kind of information to do a better job, and it's great. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. It's always great to see everybody here. Just for reference, we've had 22,000 registrants and up to, I think, almost 3,000 attendees session.
Wow.
So it's been great to see the turnout. And yeah, everybody, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Yeah, have a great rest of your day and evening. Take care.
And for my part, if anyone wants additional questions, I'm always I'm available. Cheers. Have a good one.
Yep. Take care.